Hello, fellow skeptics and believers alike. This is Skepticus, my channel, and I am your boy, Adam of Nola. Today we're going to talk about a man who is, without a doubt, one of the most prominent and influential Christian apologists of the last 50 years. I'm talking, of course, about Dr. William Lane Craig. For decades, he's been regarded as a titan of Christian philosophy, a master debater with a dizzying command of logic and theology. But in recent years, a new nickname has started to stick to him, one that I think is far more accurate: Lowbar Bill. It's a name born of frustration from watching him debate time and time again. When faced with a genuine logical or moral problem, Craig's solution isn't to solve the problem, but to simply lower the bar of reason and morality until the problem no longer seems to exist. He doesn't climb the mountain. He just declares the molehill to be the summit. The video that we're looking at today came out a little while ago, hosted by Alex O'Connor. But I wanted to highlight it because it really puts the Christian apologist mindset in the crosshairs. And it really exposes Dr. Craig's so-called morality for the bankrupt proposition that it really is. In this interview, Craig put on a masterclass in exactly why he's earned the name Lowbar Bill. He was condescending, he misrepresented his opponent's arguments, and most chillingly, when pressed on the morality of his God, he peeled back the curtain to reveal a worldview that is both brutally illogical and, frankly, terrifying. Of course, he does all this while maintaining a genuinely affable personality. He's not confrontational. He's not a Theo bro. So from that perspective, I think that he appeals to a lot of Christians. And yet, when you listen to the actual words and the concepts, the ethics and the morals that he's espousing, he can sound outright monstrous. So today we're going to walk through a bit of that conversation. We're going to see how a top-tier intellectual defends his faith, and in the process, we're going to see him abandon everything that could be considered a reasonable standard for truth and morality. So let's get into it.
I think that he is very naive philosophically and theologically, which is fairly typical for someone engaged in the physical sciences. Every one of us who tries to do cross-disciplinary work finds himself disadvantaged in that area or field with which he is less familiar. And I think that Dawkins hasn't made a serious effort to try to understand philosophy or theology.
Oh, Dr. Craig. And we are off to a running start. This is classic Craig. Right out of the gate, he dismisses Richard Dawkins, one of the most significant evolutionary biologists of his generation, as naive. He paints him with this broad brush of a simple scientist who just hasn't bothered to read the serious work in philosophy and theology, work that, coincidentally, Craig sees himself as a master of. This, of course, is a rhetorical tactic called poisoning the well. Before we even get to the substance, he's framing his opponent as an amateur, a dilettante who is out of his depth. Pay close attention to this, because the irony is about to become overwhelming. Craig is about to present a series of philosophical and theological positions so weak, so morally repugnant, that the word naive is going to seem like a hilarious understatement for his own views. He critiques Dawkins for not being a philosopher, but as we're about to see, Craig doesn't use philosophy as a tool to find truth. He uses it as a toolbox to defend a conclusion he's already decided is true. In other words, classic Christian apologetics. And there's a huge difference between the two.
Handling of the ontological argument was cringeworthy. It was embarrassing when he said that he raised this objection at a conference of theologians that he attended, and they had to appeal to modal logic in order to answer his objection. And I thought, well, the ontological argument just is an argument framed in the terms of modal logic. So that was unfortunate, I think. And then the other thing that I would mention is that what he calls the central argument of the God delusion, his argument that concludes, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist, is a tissue of fallacies. Even if you granted every one of his points, which are themselves moot, the conclusion doesn't follow from those propositions. So that it was just a horrible argument. The central argument of the book is vacuous. It's a hole.
Well, yeah, for all the talk about atheists simply lacking a belief in God and not having a position, Richard Dawkins does name one of his chapters why there almost certainly is no God. What is the argument that he presents towards that conclusion?
Pardon me?
What is the argument that he presents towards that conclusion?
It's an argument to say that the appearance of design in the natural world is overwhelming. But nevertheless, Darwin has given us an adequate naturalistic explanation of instances of biological design. We don't yet have, he says, a similar explanation in physics for the fine-tuning of the universe for life, but Darwin's success in biology ought to give us confidence that such an explanation will be forthcoming in physics. Therefore, God almost certainly does not exist.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Craig is critiquing what he calls the central argument of the God delusion. And to be fair, he's right about one thing. If you frame it as a formal deductive syllogism, the conclusion that God almost certainly does not exist doesn't strictly follow from the premises. But this is a classic case of a philosopher deliberately missing the point to score a technical victory. Dawkins' argument isn't meant to be a formal proof. It's a cumulative case based on probability, famously called the ultimate Boeing 747 gambit. The actual core of the argument is this. Highly complex and improbable things do not make good explanations for other complex and improbable things. A naturalistic process like evolution, which starts simple and builds complexity over immense time, is a far better explanation for the complexity of life than positing an even more complex, intelligent, and improbable being, a la God, from the outset. Craig completely ignores this central thrust and just attacks the surface structure, like criticizing a beautifully written novel because one sentence has a split infinitive. And his comment about the ontological argument being cringeworthy? Please. The ontological argument is a philosophical parlor trick. It's an attempt to define God into existence. It has never, in the history of human thought, convinced a single person who wasn't already a believer. For Craig to posture about how embarrassing Dawkins' handling of this esoteric word game was, is the very definition of academic snobbery. He's not engaging with the real argument. He's flexing on irrelevant trivia. But this is all just the warm-up act. The main event is coming. Alex brings up the real reason Dawkins has no time for Craig, and this is where we see the Lowbar Bill persona in its full and terrifying glory.
William Lane Craig is an immoral person because he is an apologist for genocide, pointing specifically in his original article and original objection to the issue of the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, which you've defended as a morally defensible thing for God to have commanded and for the Israelites to have enacted. So what I really want to do now is jump into this story. I want to talk about the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, what happened, why it's problematic, and what your moral defense is of that story. So perhaps we can begin by talking about who were the Canaanites.
All right. Prior to Israel's liberation from bondage in Egypt, the land of Canaan, or modern-day Israel, was populated by small clans of Canaanite inhabitants. And according to the biblical narrative, these clans of Canaanites were extremely evil. They were debauched morally and opposed God, and God let this go on for 400 years while Israel was in Egypt. But then he called Israel out of Egypt and led them to the land of Canaan and delivered the land over to Israel and said, drive out the Canaanites from the land on pain of death.
Let's be very clear about what's happening here. The first step in justifying an atrocity is always to dehumanize the victims. Craig immediately launches into a description of the Canaanites as extremely evil, debauched, and opposed to God. Later in the full interview, he cites a colleague to bring up claims of bestiality and child sacrifice. Now, was the ancient Near East a brutal place? Of course it was. But the biblical account of the Canaanites is written by their mortal enemies, the Israelites, as a propaganda piece to justify their own military conquest of the land. For Craig to present this one-sided, self-serving account as objective history is deeply disingenuous. He's poisoning the well, painting a picture of a people so monstrous that we, the audience, might be tricked into thinking that they actually deserved what was coming. He's preparing us for the horror by trying to convince us that the victims weren't really human. It's a tactic as old as war itself.
It's important to understand that God's command to Israel was not genocide, despite a superficial first reading of these narratives. More fundamentally, it was a command to drive the Canaanites out of the land on pain of death. No one had to be killed if these tribes would simply retreat and flee in the face of the advancing Israeli army. It was only those who tried to stay behind and resist who were to be completely exterminated.
Let this sink in. This is his defense. This is William Lane Craig's argument for why this wasn't a genocide. Because the Canaanites, the native inhabitants of the land, were given the choice to abandon their homes, their farms, their entire lives, and flee into the desert or be slaughtered. This is a mafia defense. It's the logic of a mob boss leaning over your counter and saying, nice little shop you got here. You can sign it over to me or I can burn it down with you inside. See? You have a choice. To frame this as a kindness is morally grotesque. He's arguing that the act of self-defense, of trying to protect your home and family from a foreign invading army, is a capital crime that justifies your complete extermination. This is not a moral argument. It's the justification of a bully. But don't worry, it's about to get so much worse. This is where he explains the philosophical system that makes all of this okay in his head.
The ethical theory that I defend is called divine command morality. And this has two components to it. First is that the good is based in God himself. God is the paradigm of moral goodness. He is by nature loving, fair, just, and so forth. Second element is that God's nature then expresses itself toward us in the form of divine commands that constitute our moral duties. According to this theory, moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by a qualified authority. So, for example, if I were driving and some random person told me to pull over, I wouldn't have any obligation to obey that person at all. But if a policeman commanded me to pull over, then in virtue of his authority, I would have a legal obligation to pull over and obey what he's done. And so the theory is that moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by the paradigm of goodness himself, who is God. Now, presumably, God doesn't issue commands to himself as to what he should do. And therefore, on this theory, God has no moral obligations to fulfill. And therefore, as you rightly said, it's impossible that God could do something wrong, because right and wrong are defined by divine commands, and God doesn't issue commands to himself to obey.
This is it. This is the absolute core of Lowbar Bill. This is the moral black hole at the center of his worldview. And quite frankly, it's the moral black hole at the center of many Christians' worldviews. It's called divine command theory, and it is one of the most intellectually and morally bankrupt ideas that has ever been conceived. It essentially says this: good is not an independent standard. Good is simply a synonym for whatever God commands. If God commands something, it is, by definition, morally right. If he forbids it, it is morally wrong. He's the ultimate dictator, and morality is nothing more than his whim. This theory makes God not a being of love and justice, but one of pure, arbitrary power. The word good becomes utterly meaningless. To say God is good is just to say God does what God wants. It's a tautology, a useless statement. Under this system, if God commanded you to torture a toddler to death for fun, that would, at that moment, become your highest moral duty. There is no independent standard of decency or compassion to appeal to. There's only raw, unquestionable power. This is not a moral system. This is a slave's rationalization for his master's cruelty, and Craig is about to admit the horrifying conclusion of this logic.
But sometimes it is actually just okay, as long as God commands it, meaning that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with killing innocent children. It can't be intrinsically wrong if there are circumstances in which it's actually not just permitted, but in fact the thing that you're ordered to do.
I would say that it is wrong in the absence of a divine command, but that God has the ability to override that by issuing a divine command, which then becomes our moral duty. And as long as this ethical theory is possible and coherent, then there just is no inconsistency between his being all good and all loving and his issuing a command of this sort. In the absence of a divine command, as I say, it could well have been immoral. But given the presence of divine command, it becomes the moral obligation of those persons to whom it was issued.
Now,
So it doesn't undermine our moral intuitions about what's right and wrong. It just introduces the qualification of a divine command.
but it would mean that
can override that.
there's nothing intrinsically wrong with taking the life of an innocent child. Nothing intrinsically wrong with it.
Well, again, this is going to depend on your moral theory, Alex. I think that right and wrong, moral obligations, are determined by imperatives issued by a qualified authority. And so in the absence of such imperatives, there literally is no right and wrong.
In the absence of such imperatives, there literally is no right or wrong. There you have it. That is the endpoint of William Lane Craig's sophisticated theology, a universe where the act of killing an innocent child is not, in and of itself, wrong. It's a morally neutral act that only becomes wrong if a divine dictator happens to issue a decree against it on that day. This is the ultimate hypocrisy of his entire project. Craig is famous for his moral argument for God, where he claims that the existence of objective moral values proves that there must be a God. He appeals to our shared intuition that some things are just plain wrong. But here, when his own holy book backs him into a corner, he reveals his cards. He admits that in his worldview, nothing is objectively wrong. It's all just subject to the commands of his deity. He guts his own most popular argument. He calls Dawkins naive for not understanding philosophy, and then he presents a moral system that would make a Bronze Age warlord blush. He has lowered the bar of morality so low that it is buried deep in the earth, all to protect his preconceived belief in an inerrant and unquestionably good God. So what have we seen today? We've seen a celebrated intellectual condescend to a scientist, misrepresent his arguments, and then, to defend an ancient atrocity, he's advocated for a moral framework that empties the words good, right, and love of all human meaning. This is, at least in part, why he is Lowbar Bill, because he doesn't solve moral problems. He simply defines them out of existence. His philosophy isn't a search for truth. It's a desperate post hoc justification for the indefensible. And that's not just intellectual dishonesty. It's profoundly dangerous, because a worldview that can justify the slaughter of children yesterday is a worldview that can justify anything tomorrow. This isn't just an abstract debate. This is about whether our sense of right and wrong is based on empathy, reason, and the well-being of conscious creatures, or if it's based on blind obedience to an ancient text and an unseeable dictator. Craig has made his choice. I hope the rest of us choose more wisely. What do you think? Is divine command theory a viable moral system? Let me know in the comments. And if you value these kinds of critical deep dives, please hit that like button and subscribe for more. This is my channel, Skepticus. I am your boy, Adam. If I have said anything that has offended Yahweh or Jebus or the Holy Spirit or Allah or Zeus or Odin or anyone else, this is their chance to actually interject and set me straight. Guys, you really need to be quicker on this. Okay. Yeah, they're not picking up at the moment. I don't know. I'm sure that maybe if I pray harder, they'll answer. But in the interim, I'm going to assume that they've agreed with all of this. Thank you for joining me here on Breakdowns and Beatdowns. This has been another glorious episode. I'm glad that you were with me. I hope to see you on many future videos. And until I do, lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.